Special thank you to Saida Khala for sharing the speeches of Maulana Azad, which I found most insightful, particularly in the context in which we are meeting today. I am, of course, no scholar of Maulana Azad, so I won't be able to make any sort of erudite comments on his work and life. But I am going to start by referring to some points made in his speeches, which I found have a very strong bearing on some of the challenges that the education sector is facing today. And then I'll try and relate some of those to the topic that I have been given to speak on today, which is building accountability within the RTE framework. So 2 points in particular that I want to draw attention to from the speeches. The first one relates to the very strong sense of public purpose that Maulana Azad associated with education. In one of his speeches made early in 1947, he refers to a system of national education as one of the fundamental tasks which faces any government. And then he goes on to say, and I quote, that not only is the existing condition of society determined by the quality of individuals composing it, but its future as well. And nothing has a more important bearing on the quality of individuals than the type of education imparted. This I found as a very powerful statement that highlights not just the quality of the individual, but also the role of the state in ensuring it. The idea or sense of quality, which he focused on in terms of the growth of the individual as a person, but also as a member of democratic society, is, I think, in so many ways being lost today. What we see instead are goals which are defined in very narrow terms, even goals of education, that encompass, just simple quantifiable outcomes of learning with very little effort or thought directed towards larger public purposes, or even in fact to fulfilling basic goals of education like equity and providing a level playing field, as Manorma ji also mentioned earlier today. In fact, just to make a slight diversion, I was quite struck recently during an interview that I conducted with a recently retired bureaucrat from the Central Education Ministry, who quite candidly said that what we really need to do is separate education from equity, and then we would be able to have a more efficient education system. I mean, nothing I thought could be further from the imagination and the vision that Maulana Azad had for education of the country. And I think that's the sort of thing that presents a particular challenge in the education sector today, and we would really do well to remember the words of Maulana Azad in that context. In fact, in another one of his speeches from the earlier period, he says again very candidly that the private sector alone cannot be tasked with the job of providing education because it lacks the liberal sensibility that is required to provide the kind of education necessary for building a democratic nation. These sentiments are also stand in really stark contrast to what has been happening in the last few decades, with privatization gaining so much momentum, especially with the encouragement from the state itself. And it appears as though the state has all but handed over responsibility to non-state actors and absorbed itself from the national duty that Maulana Azad refers to. This is not to say that he eschewed completely a role for the private sector, but he saw them as working under the supervision of the state and in line with the larger public purpose, rather than making the goals of the private a measure of the public, which is what we see happening today. So, how do we revert or re-imbue the sense of publicness or public purpose into education, I think is one of the fundamental challenges we face today. And the RTE actually has been an effort in that direction, but unfortunately it faces some serious bottlenecks today, which I will return to in a bit. But the second point that struck me from the speeches of Maulana Azad was his understanding of the link between education and citizenship. He states very clearly in one of his speeches that his belief is that education is geared towards what he calls the production of a consciousness of citizenship. He then goes on to describe that consciousness as promotion of social solidarity among people. This was really, to me, it is a very powerful description of citizenship, because it also hits out at the challenges we are facing both nationally, but also within the basic education system. The failure to realize and understand both that solidarity is germane to the consciousness of citizenship, but also that these ideas need and must be instilled early on through the education system. These are kind of thoughts and ideas which are really sort of receding from the mainstream of education provision today, and which we really need to bring back in. In fact, elaborating further, he includes a knowledge of rights and duties, both at an individual level and at the level of the state, as important aspects of citizenship understanding. And very often, I was really struck by this because very often in the writings on citizenship, particularly from that period, we see a reference to duties, but by acknowledging the rights aspect, he once again brings the responsibility of the state into the picture, and also the importance to the citizen himself or herself. And he says very clearly, we must not for a moment forget that it is the birthright of every individual to receive at least the basic education, without which he cannot fully discharge his duties as a citizen. So I think that his understanding of education as a right, which he enunciated very early on, is really it's worth remembering again as we kind of battle basic issues of individual rights in the education sphere and beyond, as has been mentioned by the earlier speakers as well. So keeping this broad context of Maulana Azad's vision and understanding of education and the role of the state, and let me turn now to the issue of RTE, which was, I think, perhaps one of the first serious attempts to put that vision into formal reality. Unfortunately, that understanding of education as a citizenship right and the obligation of the state to provide it remains unrealized today. But I think that that it is important to sort of remember what the purpose of it was, and to see how it can be sort of brought on track again. Since I'm going to speak about accountability, one of the reasons I think that the poor realization of RT entitlements, although it's not the only reason, has been in fact the lack of an appropriate accountability mechanism within the RT framework and within the structures of government that are tasked with implementing the entitlements under the RTE. And related to this is also the manner in which the private sector has been included within its ambit and the role that it is playing in providing education today. So I'm going to just mention three aspects or ways in which accountability can be built into the system, and then a little bit about how the private or the non-state sector fits into that framework, or perhaps doesn't fit into that framework. I think while the Act is the first aspect of accountability I want to talk about is the accountability within the system of delivery. While the Act places the primary responsibility on the state, it unfortunately has not put into place a clearly defined accountability mechanism. Hence, while there are specific entitlements, there is no indication of who exactly within the system is responsible for delivering any of them. So to give a very simple example, if the teacher-pupil ratio mandated in the Act is not adhered to, or a particular incentive due to a child is not made available, it is not clear who exactly can be held responsible, or rather where the buck stops. Is it the panchayat, the block or district education officer, NCPCR, or the minister himself or herself? What this means is that the citizen, whose right it is to get all of their entitlements, whether they be children or their parents in place of their children, end up going from pillar to post trying to get their just dues. And more often than not, they return empty-handed. So what is needed in the first place, and which is still unfortunately absent, is to build a kind of accountability matrix for the system that goes all the way up the system and is not resting just on the teacher, who tends to bear the burden of all aspects of non-implementation or poor functioning of the system. A simple matrix that just states against each entitlement who is responsible for its delivery, in what time frame the delivery can be expected, and who is the supervising authority to whom an appeal can be made, and so forth. That would just make it so much simpler for citizens to follow through with their rights, the right that they have now been guaranteed under the Constitution. Unfortunately, currently, the panchayats have been given the grievance redress authority. And while in principle that is a great idea, they have neither the powers or the resources to take any action. Both of those still lie with the executive, and there is no convergence mechanism between the panchayat and the executive either. So a grievance that comes to the panchayat simply lies there. Of course, this ensuring an accountability in this sort of fashion is much harder to do for non-physical or non-quantifiable aspects of education, and there are many of those important ones. But the point that I'm trying to make is that fixing responsibilities within the state structure, even for the smallest things, can send a very powerful message regarding the seriousness with which the state takes its legal obligations. It sends a message regarding the accountability of the state to the citizen, which is what is guaranteed and what is really implied within the framework of a right. I'm reminded of the time when I worked at the National Commission. Shantaji will remember, she was the chairperson at that time, that we tried very hard, in fact, to develop such a template. And to be fair, the excellent bureaucrats that we worked with and interacted with at that time were also extremely receptive of the ideas that were coming from people like us who were in fact outside of the state system in many ways. And they even attempted to push some of those ideas down to the state level. But unfortunately, not much action was taken because there was such a strong sort of reluctance and even refusal to fix accountabilities within the ranks of the bureaucracy that not much was achieved, unfortunately. And the lack of such a accountability system or matrix really limits the ability of the citizen to avail of their rights in any real sense. So the question is there further recourse within the RTE framework? And yes, technically there is, and it lies with the judiciary, because RTE is a justiciable right, unlike the earlier phase where it was a directive principle and did not carry a judicial mandate. After the 86th Amendment to the Constitution, it is now actually a justiciable right, so which implicates the judiciary directly in the accountability framework for RTE. But as far as the judiciary is concerned, apart from the fact that the institution itself leaves a lot to be desired in these days, as we all know, the fact that RTE is a fundamental right means that while the judiciary can be approached, it is only at the level of the higher judiciary, namely the High Courts or the Supreme Court. And as we know that a lot of the grievances might arise with people who have limited access to the higher judiciary, both in terms of financial resources or in terms of just being able to access institutions which are sort of beyond them in a sense, physically and otherwise. So in fact, despite it being made a justiciable right, this represents a lacuna in the legal accountability framework for the citizen. Now, many suggestions have been made for allowing, for sort of rectifying the situation by allowing lower courts to hear appeals, or even by setting up, alternate systems like appointing an ombudsman, which has happened in many European countries, for instance. But again, unfortunately, the approach towards rights and actually ensuring the delivery of rights has been very tardy within the system. So not much progress has been made thus far. Unfortunately, the activism that the courts had exhibited earlier through the PIL process, etc., has also waned. The courts are much more inclined towards non-interference in matters perceived to lie in the domain of the executive now. The use of things like the continuing mandamus that allowed courts an oversight on implementation is now, in fact, actively discouraged. So in effect, the justiciability of the right is impaired. And I have been looking at trying to map some of the legal cases that have come up to the courts in relation to RTE, and they present a rather sorry picture. One case in particular is worth mentioning. It relates to the salaries being paid to school teachers in Gujarat, which was found to be even below the minimum wage. Clearly, this is a violation not just of the RTE, but of the Minimum Wage Act as well. And even though the High Court in Gujarat did order the state government to correct this anomaly, failure to comply with this, very obvious sort of misdemeanor, so to speak, has led the case to come up to the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, it has been more than 5 years, and the matter is yet to actually come up for a hearing. So, I mean, this is, just to say that what has been happening in recent years, despite the even the passage of the RTE Act and the constitutional amendment that preceded it, the approach within the structures of the state continues to remain continues to not imagine education as a right, and actually take it seriously enough in the way that Maulana Azad envisioned it, and in the way that many others who have fought for this right have envisioned it. And I think that that is something that really needs a lot of serious discussion and debate in the current times, in particular, where all of our rights are so much in question around us. But let me mention another aspect of the accountability system, in a sense, which is somewhat different. While enforcing or building an accountability mechanism within the executive or through the judiciary, in a sense, is trying to impose an accountability framework from above, but there is also the possibility of building it from the ground up. And I would call this, in a sense, accountability by praxis. And it involves a collaboration, if you like, between the state and civil society actors. And an example of this was actually seen by me and my colleagues at NCPCR, and again, Shantaji would remember, when we conducted the first social audits of RTE way back in 2010-11. Unlike many other social audits, these were designed to bring all stakeholders together on a common platform and resolve issues collectively and locally as far as possible. A key element of the audits were the Shiksha Samvads, or a dialogue, as the name suggests, between citizens and the officials in charge of education. At these Samvads, ordinary folk sat across the table from the officials and presented their grievances. And the officials tried to resolve them as far as possible there and then, but otherwise offered to take it to the next level, those the ones that they could not sort out then. As the Samvads were made a monthly affair, the officials had to face the citizens every month on issues that remain unresolved. Needless to say, not every issue was resolved, but several were. And even though the matters that they did resolve were small because of the limited decision-making powers or resources that were available, that are available at the lower bureaucracy, they did achieve something quite large, and that was that they started to build a kind of trust among the citizens with respect to the state. They saw that the voice of the citizen, or the citizens saw that their voice could be heard, and some action, however small, was being taken on its basis. And that established an accountability of the state to the people. It also had a ripple effect. The neighboring areas where such an exercise was not taking place started to demand it too. And together, an accountability by praxis began to emerge and be established at the local level. So even if the system does not overhaul itself, it is possible through some mechanisms of these type to build it up from the ground, where accountability can be geared towards the citizen rather than to the higher echelons within the state. It is really unfortunate that the space for such joint state and civil society action has shrunk so drastically in recent years, as in fact has the space for the bureaucracy to initiate steps geared towards more accountability to the people. I will, however, in this regard, mention that a few months ago, the Ministry of Education did initiate a process of sort of conducting or restarting social audits of education. And Anita ji, who will speak soon after, was also part of that consultation, but unfortunately, nothing has come of that either. I think, which is just an indication of how hard it is to push through with initiatives, particularly involving people, involving citizens, involving civic action, and see them through within the government structures. So, just to sum up this section, it is important to have built accountability systems, institutionalized accountability systems. If one is really serious about providing education as a right, if one is serious about implementing the right to education. But it is equally important or necessary to try, in the absence of institutionalized structures, to build it up from the ground. And civil society does have an important role to play in it. And one hopes that, in the spirit in which Maulana Azad also appealed to the nation to be involved in the education process, that some such initiatives can continue to be built and to grow. And one can try and make some sort of changes in that process along the way. Let me now turn to another issue within the accountability framework, which relates to the position of non-state providers. Now, this is a somewhat more tricky issue, partly because the state itself has been pushing for more and more non-state actors in education. And this is not just in the context of provisioning the service directly, but also in the provisioning of supplementary services. And even more worrying, though, is the fact that a larger and larger role is now being given to the private sector in setting the policy agenda. Now, this is a huge problem. It is a particular problem because the priorities, goals, and incentives of the private sector are vastly different from those of the public. And while public provisioning may and does default to, maybe too often, it can be made accountable, whereas public accountability for the private sector does not even have a conceptual peg. So in this context, I want to mention that very quickly, although unfortunately time doesn't permit, while it is a important area, that private minority institutions have been removed from the ambit of the RTE. Unfortunately, this happened after the RTE was passed through a particular case that came to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided to remove them from basically the ambit of the RTE Act. I think this raises some very fundamental questions about the position of minorities and minority institutions in the framework of a fundamental right. And it is a complex issue, no doubt. And as I said, I will not be able to go into the details here, but I think it's important to flag it, and to particularly in relation to what we see happening currently in Karnataka and elsewhere. In fact, there was recently a quite disturbing order from the Assam High Court also regarding minority institutions. So in the context of it, of seeing education as a universal right in the way that Maulana Azad saw it, and even in the context of the RTE, I think these are some important questions that need to be addressed in the spirit in which is sort of a collaborative, collective spirit of solidarity that Maulana Azad embodied in his life and work. But it is also worth mentioning here, actually, that the private space, which has expanded, almost exponentially in recent years, has also, in that sense, opened up the space, and it incorporates schools of all kinds of hues. Several of them which are highly sectarian, and to use Maulana Azad's word, very, very narrow-minded in their approach towards education. These schools often tend to follow curricula that do not subscribe to constitutional values as prescribed in the RTE, etc., and which really Maulana Azad would have been aghast to learn about. Unfortunately, not all of them subscribe, to the majoritarian agenda. There is even now a growing, perhaps in reaction to the growing influence of majoritarianism, they have emerged in recent years categories of schools that, while modern in infrastructure, etc., incorporate highly regressive social practices and religious dogma. And I would really encourage colleagues and friends and others here to, take a closer look at some of these schools, because many of them are, sort of flying under the radar and instilling a lot of damage, I think, in the social fabric of the country. An important element in making the non-state or private actors accountable, which is really what we're talking about here, would be to have a regulatory mechanism that can keep an eye on the private. Unfortunately, that is sorely missing. So while, as Maulana Azad also wrote about, the private or the non-state actors have a role to play, because very often their goals and incentives may diverge from those of the public. It is important to have for them to be to work under the supervision of the state, which is also what Maulana Azad spoke about. Unfortunately, we don't have we have a very, very rudimentary, if at all, a regulatory mechanism. I have recently concluded a paper for UNESCO on the regulation of non-state in education for the next Global Education Monitoring Report, and I was quite surprised to find that the systems for regulating the functioning of non-state are either non-existent or very, very poorly defined. For one, they seem to be limited largely to granting of licenses to open a school. And as far as supplementary services are concerned, there is, at least on paper, a mechanism for some, like the midday meal, and that perhaps is because of the activism of the Right to Food movement and the NFSA that followed it. But for most other supplementary services like textbook publishing or testing, through which all kinds of divisive agendas can be brought into the system, there is absolutely no regulation. And we see more and more that such books and other things are entering the education system. Even for the teacher training institutes, another place where divisive agendas can creep in. The norms relate only to the starting of a school of an institute, but not to how it functions thereafter. Public-private partnerships are another category of schools that are growing, at a very fast pace, which also basically fly under the radar. And the norms, unfortunately, that do exist are also not fully. I'm going to finish very, very soon. The norms that do exist are also not fully complied with because of state capacity concerns, etc. And in fact, many officials are miffed at having to regulate and monitor private provisioning in addition to the public. So because of this sort of, lack of a proper structure, what we find is that the private sector is really going largely unnoticed. And the problem is being made worse by the fact that the private lobby has made deep inroads into the political establishment, which means that even if someone wants to take action, they are under great political pressure to hold back. So in other words, accountability of the private sector is virtually non-existent. There was within the RTE, the NCPCR, SCPCR mechanism, but it suffers from some serious design flaws and so has been unable to really take on the role that was expected of it. But in the end, I just want to say that if one is serious about the right to education, then ensuring that there is a system of grievance redress for the citizen that is part of a larger accountability framework, it will be very hard to realize the vision and the dream of Maulana Azad in terms of pushing education as a right in this country. Thank you.